My cousin is 10 years older than me. And when I was a kid, she brought puzzling and intriguing and sometimes scary things into my awareness. The soundtrack to gospel. I still remember hearing Godspell for the first time as she swayed above my tiny little portable record player, her long black curtain of hair a fascinating dance of style. And as a family with post-war roots in Ohio, one year, she and my parents talked in hushed voices about Kent State. Yesterday was the 54th anniversary of that day in 1970 when National Guard responding to persistent student protest over Vietnam opened fire for just 13 seconds and changed so many lives. My colleague, Melissa Carville-Zemer, wrote in a column on Friday, "I did not realize when I accepted the call to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Kent in 2005 that I was about to begin an extended study in community trauma and its impact over time." On May 4th, 1970, she wrote, members of the National Guard shot into a crowd of students protesting the expansion of the Vietnam War with the invasion of Cambodia. And 4 Kent State students were killed that day, and 9 were wounded. Kent's a small town, Melissa goes on, and the UU congregation there was and is deeply connected to the university. It is impossible to overstate, she says, the impact of these events on the individuals involved, the university, the congregation, the town, the state, and really on students everywhere. Over the years, I heard from many of the people who were there on that day, as well as from scholars and activists about those tragic events on May 4th and all that followed. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. I actually remember when an older friend first read me William Butler Yeats's words. They seemed completely abstract to me at the time. This idea that an apocalyptic time could come when the weight of the center would be too heavy to hold, it seemed impossible and unimaginable to myself back then. I was idealistic about my ability to influence our public sphere through my chosen professions of journalism and public policy. I had just finished my first round of graduate studies at Duke University, where one of my professors had been studying for more than a decade the horrific conditions that the Palestinians were living in then, in the mid-1980s. William Butler Yeats, imagining this apocalyptic time in which our institutions fail us, it seemed improbable. And yet, as the University of California at Berkeley scholar activist John A. Powell says, all of our pain has weight in this place, and so do our dreams of what is possible. What is possible, I will tell you today, I believe, if we pay attention. Rose Ann Canfora, whose brother was one of those injured in the Kent State shooting, said in an NPR post yesterday that she sees similarities with the students who are protesting at college campuses across the country today, calling for a ceasefire in Gaza and university divestment from companies linked to Israel. She says they at least know that they don't want famine and suffering and death done in their name, she says. And so it's inspiring to see them having similar conversations that we had, saying we don't like what we're seeing and we need to speak out against it. My colleague Melissa Carville-Zemer, who is a national leader among us ministers in Unitarian Universalism, says, the voices of student protesters are critical to our collective discernment about the most pressing matters of our times. Whether or not we agree with what they have to say, I hope we can all remember the grave risks that come from police and military suppression of student voices and organizing. I'll say to you today that I believe that, hard as they may be to hear some of these voices, we as a people need to listen. One of the reasons that the center is not holding John A. Powell and his colleague Ben McBride, a Bay Area local minister and human rights crusader, say is that we need to pay more attention to bridging, and bonding. Now, McBride has made a name for himself in his work in which he brought police and members of the Black community together to find solutions to the proliferation of police killing of Black people around the nation. And he points out that bridging, in his mind, is what we do when we're reaching out to someone who we believe to be very different from ourselves, whereas bonding is with those who we see as similar, and yet whose lives we may not fully understand. Bridging and bonding, he says, McBride, I think it's more about becoming the kinds of human beings who can take care of one another so that we can do the work of turning towards one another. When we turn towards each other, we widen the circle of concern for humanity. And he goes on to say, I think the lower hanging fruit in our society has already been picked. And in the time we are living in, I'm going to make a choice to see you as human. We have to find the humanity to actively work to widen the human concern, and that includes people who are actively working to constrict the circle of human concern. What, he asks, is the alternative? So I ask us this morning to think about, how do we listen to one another across difference, whether that difference is the difference of bridging or the difference of bonding? Someone that you may feel close to, but whose real views about what's happening in the world you may not know. I'm puzzled, honestly, that over these last years I've heard many among us say our work only should be with the bridging, reaching out to those with whom we have the absolute most difference, and that if we can't do that, then they're not going to worry about doing any other kind of work, the work of bonding. I'm not sure that's a good long-term solution. A college student protesting genocide in Palestine has more commonalities with us than someone who believes we have the right to drop bombs on other nations that do not do as we say. And yet we may find it harder to hear the one whose voice and views are closer to us. Ben McBride says, just because you cannot build a bridge everywhere doesn't mean you can't build it anywhere. So instead of thinking about the hardest person to bridge with, he says, why not think about bridging something that's a little more reachable? If we can do that, he says, we can build muscle memory, we can build faith in ourselves, and we can go deeper in our practice of embracing one another in our humanity. I have to say this morning that I respectfully disagree with our president, who in response to the pro-Palestinian demonstrations across the nation this week said that protest should not lead to disorder. Protest interrupts order when leaders will not pay attention to important truths. With over 35,000 Palestinians dead in the war on Gaza and the inhumane withholding of food and water and desperately needed medical supplies, and I have to say that yesterday this was recounted by a doctor who had just come back from Palestine. Here in this sanctuary yesterday, this room was overflowing, and those windows were filled with the pictures of children who had been killed. In the light of this event, which was sponsored, I want to say, by our own Mount Diablo Peace and Justice Center, and you can actually see the coverage on ABC7 if you want to go home and look at it. In light of this, I believe with all my heart that we must listen to those voices, those young voices across our nation who are doing what young activists have done throughout our history, signaling towards the leading edge in moral outrage. In speaking to many, I know that there is real and valid fear against anti-Semitism, and that's a reason that many just are trying not to pay attention to this issue. We all know that anti-Semitism is wrong, and yet it was our younger activists who spent hours watching videos and said what the mainstream media took days to say, that the violence in UCLA was not caused predominantly by clashes between pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli students, but rather by dangerous outside agitators. And the New York Times finally picked up that story this morning. Anti-Semitism is also a moral wrong, and that's why Reverend Rodney has been organizing us to speak up against it on Tuesday night. And that does not need to be our only choice. John A. Powell says we must stop limiting ourselves as we think about the Middle East. We create false divisions and false sufferings. He says the toxicity is to make my pain the only one that counts. He says, I refuse to say that one child's life is better than another's. What if that child is Palestinian? What if that child is Jewish? I have children, he says, and I would die for my children in a heartbeat, but I think many parents feel the same way. And even though I would die for my children in a heartbeat, I can't say that my children are more important than their children. There is no other, he says. Powell and McBride talk about the bonding we must pursue with those who are closer to us, and yet with whom we may not agree. There is a poll that was done recently this week that found that overall 53% believe it's good that Columbia suspended the students protesting there, and that jumps to 68% for those over 65. And yet, as the Washington Post put it in 2020, a good protester is a bad protester in the misty rearview mirror. And the Los Angeles Times noted 2 years ago that increasingly peaceful protests are seen as ineffective because of the lack of public response and media coverage of them. I believe that we who are older must ask our government to pay attention, to listen to the voices of our younger people, not because they're 100% right, but because they're speaking a truth into our time. And quite frankly, the current administration seems to be unable to hear the concerns of anyone under 70. Many who have been avoiding these stories to preserve their own sense of peace may need to take just 1 hour and look at some of the news accounts of what has been happening using the weapons that we have been providing in Gaza. I was just 30 years old, when my friend read me Yeats's words. They seemed, as I said, like a vague threat. Now they seem like a prophecy. In 2022, the Pew Foundation Media Research Study found that, on average, Democrats and Republicans are farther apart ideologically today than they have been at any other time in the last half-century. And an earlier study they said that only the 10% at each end of the spectrum seem to be committed to engagement in the democratic process on a regular basis. The center, my friends, is not holding, and we need to be aware and work to counter that. Ben McBride, who I had the privilege of taking a civil rights tour with in 2019, envisions a large enough table for everyone's suffering and asks, how do we commit to spaces that are designed in such a way that they bring more perspective then spaces where people are proximate into this space? And how do we develop new norms about how we show up in these spaces when we actually start not just sharing, but listening and pausing and having curiosity about one another? What does it mean, he asks, to come to a bigger table knowing that 80 or 90% of what you hear you might disagree with, maybe even violently, but how can you listen, he asks, for the other 10%? We need to bridge. Yes, we need to bond, to preserve our democracy. I will be contacting the White House again this week. Maybe a few more of you would like to join me this time. Here we are, a place where we can seek in the coming months ways to engage with one another and perhaps to form new bonds. We will also be a place where we can find new ways to center our spirit and keep our calm in these chaotic times that were already chaotic. I don't know, for all of you, which of the pieces of music today spoke more to your experience of protest. Perhaps it was that hammer at the beginning. Perhaps it was Blowing in the Wind, or perhaps it was that beautiful rendition that Johanna did about the piece called Mercy. Every generation has its own struggles, and we need to hear them all. With all deference to Yeats, I will end with the words of a young Oakland poet, Michelle Lee. She says, "We be a story. We be a story of love so brave it builds a bridge where we honor each other's rage. In that place lie pearls of great price."